Rome, 67 AD. The air is thick with incense and whispers. You see Emperor Nero, the most powerful man in the empire, walking through the forum with his new bride. Draped in jewels, veiled in silk, she looks every bit the Empress of Rome. But the crowd does not cheer. They murmur, because everyone knows the horrifying truth. This woman is no woman at all. She was once a boy named Sporus. What you are about to hear is not a tale of romance, but of obsession. Not of love, but of possession. It is the story of how grief can twist into madness, and how absolute power can turn a human being into a living echo of the dead. This is the tragedy of Sporus, the boy who was forced to become an empress. Asterisk. Please tell us where you watched this story, and please subscribe to support our channel and listen to stories like this. You are standing in the crowded streets of Rome. The year is 67 AD, and the empire is alive with spectacle. Merchants call out their prices in the marketplace. Senators in pristine white togas are carried in litters. Soldiers march through the forum with shields gleaming in the sun. But all of that fades when a single figure appears. The emperor himself, Nero, walks proudly at the head of his retinue. His robes glisten with gold thread, his crown catches the light, and by his side walks a figure wrapped in silks, veiled and adorned with jewels. At first glance, it looks like the Empress of Rome, but the murmurs that ripple through the crowd tell another story. Everyone knows the truth. The woman beside Nero was once a boy named Sporus. This single scene captures the madness of an emperor and the tragedy of a child who was forced to become something he was not. But to understand how Rome arrived at this moment, you have to step back in time to the boy who would become emperor, and the woman whose death created a void so deep that no reality could ever fill it. Nero Claudius Caesar was born into privilege, but his childhood was anything but secure. His father died when he was just a child, and his mother, Agrippina, fought tooth and nail to position him for power. When Nero finally became emperor at the age of 16 in 54 AD, he was the youngest man ever to rule Rome. Imagine being thrust onto the throne of an empire of 60 million people before you were even old enough to fully grasp the weight of responsibility. The Senate looked on warily, the Roman people watched with curiosity, and the world held its breath. In the early years, Nero exceeded expectations. He reduced taxes, funded grand public entertainments, and presented himself as a man of the people. He even dared to step onto the stage, performing in plays and musical recitals, much to the shock of the traditional elite. For ordinary Romans, it was electrifying. Their ruler was not distant, but visible, theatrical, even approachable. For a time, they loved him. But power without limits does not merely elevate. It corrupts. The same traits that made Nero so appealing as theatricality, his hunger for admiration, his need to be the center of attention, were the very seeds of his decline. He could not tolerate criticism. He could not endure opposition. And above all, he could not distinguish between love and possession. It was in this dangerous mixture of charm and obsession that Poppaea Sabina entered his life. Poppaea was a woman who understood power as few others did. Born into a prominent family, she was strikingly beautiful, but her true weapon was her intelligence. She knew how to maneuver in court, how to influence decisions, how to turn admiration into advantage. To Nero, she was intoxicating. Compared to his first wife, Octavia, a woman of noble birth, a reserved and quiet Poppaea, was fire itself. Bold, ambitious, commanding. Nero fell for her completely. Their relationship began as an affair, whispered about in the corridors of the palace, but it soon consumed the emperor. Octavia was set aside, disgraced, and eventually executed, clearing the way for Nero to marry Poppaea. The wedding was a spectacle of wealth, Rome glittering with jewels, music, and pageantry. Nero had found his perfect match, or so it seemed. But perfection does not exist, especially not in the heart of an emperor already teetering on the edge. Nero's devotion to Poppaea quickly became something darker. He showered her with gifts that emptied the treasury. He stationed guards at her side, claiming to protect her but in reality to watch her, to ensure that no other man could even glance at her too long. He filled his palaces with statues and portraits of her, surrounding himself with her image. Poppaea became not just his wife, but his obsession. And obsession is a fragile thing, always at risk of shattering. Poppaea was not blind to the risks, nor was she passive. She knew her beauty gave her power, and she used it to advance her family and allies. But she also challenged Nero in ways no one else dared. She criticized his political decisions, mocked his endless stage performances, and argued with him openly. She was perhaps the only person in the empire who could stand up to him, and that made her both indispensable and dangerously vulnerable. The breaking point came in 65 AD. Poppaea was pregnant, carrying Nero's child. The details of what happened next vary depending on the historian, but they all agree on the outcome. During a heated argument, some say about Nero's obsession with chariot races, others about his endless performances. His rage boiled over. In the middle of their quarrel, Nero struck her. Some accounts describe a single vicious kick to her stomach. Others say it was a brutal assault. What is certain is that Poppaea fell, fatally injured. By nightfall, both she and the unborn child were dead. For a man who commanded legions, who could order executions with a word, who was worshipped as a god in parts of his empire, this was the one act he could not undo. He had destroyed the one thing he claimed to love most, and it shattered him. Nero's grief did not resemble ordinary mourning. He refused to cremate Poppaea as Roman custom demanded. Instead, he had her embalmed, entombed with treasures greater than those of past emperors, and declared her divine. He created a cult in her honor, demanded she be spoken of in the present tense, and left her seat empty at banquets, as if she were still alive. The imperial court became a theater of denial. To contradict, it was to risk exile, imprisonment, or worse. But denial was not enough. What Nero wanted was resurrection, and that is where Sporus enters this story. Sporus was a boy of about 14 or 15. He had been born into slavery, but freed as a child, raised within the palace walls. He was educated enough for minor administrative duties, and like many freedmen in the imperial household, he lived in a strange limbo of privilege and vulnerability. His future might have been secure, even comfortable. But fate, or perhaps misfortune, had given him something that would forever alter his life. He bore an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea. The resemblance was more than casual. Ancient writers describe his delicate features, his soft complexion, the shape of his eyes. In a world that believed physical likeness could hint at spiritual connection, the similarity was almost supernatural. When Nero looked at Sporus, he did not see a boy. He saw a chance to undo the irreversible. Imagine the chilling weight of that moment. The emperor of Rome, broken by grief and guilt, suddenly finds a face that mirrors the woman he killed. What would stop him from trying to make the illusion real? Nothing. He was Nero, and no one could say no. The emperor summoned his physicians and gave an order that would forever mark. Sporus is one of the most tragic figures in Roman history. The boy was to be castrated. His body was to be reshaped. He was to become Poppaea reborn. Roman medicine was crude and brutal. Surgical instruments were primitive, infection common, anesthesia minimal. The procedure itself would have been excruciating. Sporus would have been restrained, his cries echoing off the palace walls as physicians carried out the emperor's command. Many who underwent such operations did not survive, but Sporus did. And survival, in his case, was no mercy. When he recovered, the process of transformation began. Tutors taught him how to walk with the grace of a woman, how to gesture, how to sit. He was trained to speak in softer tones, to move with calculated elegance. Cosmetics were applied to his face, powders to soften his features, rouge to bring color to his cheeks. His hair was styled in elaborate fashions, adorned with ornaments once worn by Poppaea herself. Every day he was remade, not as himself, but as someone else. His own identity was erased piece by piece, and then came the final step. Nero would not merely keep Sporus as a private illusion. He would make the delusion public. In the spring of 67 A.D., the emperor staged a wedding. It was not a quiet affair hidden from the eyes of Rome. It was a full imperial ceremony, complete with priests, musicians, feasts, and vows. Nero and Sporus stood together, hand in hand, before the empire. The boy, dressed in silks and jewels, recited vows. They shared sacred bread. They signed documents that declared their union official. Rome's elite looked on, masks of joy hiding barely contained horror. But none dared object. To do so would be to challenge the emperor himself. From that moment onward, Sporus ceased to exist as a boy. He was now Sabina, the living echo of Poppaea. He had attendants of his own, jewels, a household staff, even an income from the imperial treasury. He accompanied Nero to public events, sat beside him at banquets, and played the role of dutiful wife. But beneath the silks and veils was a child who had been stripped of everything: his freedom, his identity, his future. Each day became a performance upon which his life depended. He had to mirror the mannerisms of a woman he had never known, respond to memories that were not his, and play a role he never chose. Every mistake could mean death. Every hesitation could be fatal. And all the while, Nero convinced himself that his dead wife had truly returned. As the months passed, the illusion deepened. Nero paraded Sporus through the streets, displayed him to foreign dignitaries, and spoke to him as if he truly were Poppaea. For Rome, hardened though it was to the excesses of emperors, this was a spectacle that could not be ignored. Whispers spread, laughter hidden behind closed doors, horror masked by forced smiles. Everyone knew the truth. Everyone also knew the danger of speaking it aloud. And then, as Nero's empire began to crumble, Sporus's nightmare only grew darker. The boy who had once been a shadow within the palace was now at the center of its strangest and most disturbing illusion. His life was no longer his own. It was the emperor's theater, and he was the unwilling star. But this was only the beginning of his tragedy. The fall of Nero would not free him. It would only bind him to a new cycle of humiliation and despair, one that would ultimately lead Sporus to make the only choice that was ever truly his own. Asterisk. You are standing in the grand halls of the imperial palace, and the marble floors beneath your feet gleam in the torchlight. It is here, in these echoing corridors, that the illusion of Nero's perfect world is maintained. Rome sees only what he wants it to see. In the eyes of the empire, he is not a grieving widower, not a murderer, but a man who has resurrected his wife through sheer force of will. And by his side, always, is Sporus, no longer a boy, no longer himself, but the empress reborn. At first glance, the transformation looks complete. Sporus appears in public, draped in silks, his hair styled in intricate Roman fashions, his face powdered and painted until the resemblance to Poppaea is undeniable. Nero calls him by her name, Sabina. He introduces him at banquets as his wife, seats him in the place once reserved for the empress, and expects everyone in attendance to play along. But you, standing here, can feel the tension in the room. Behind every smile is fear. Behind every polite toast lies unease. The illusion is so fragile that one misplaced glance, one whispered word, could shatter it. For Sporus, life has become a prison built of silk and gold. Every morning, attendants arrive to prepare him for his role. He is bathed, dressed, painted, and adorned in jewels that once belonged to Poppæa. He is taught to walk with grace, to lower his eyes at the right moments, to speak softly and never contradict the emperor. His tutors remind him daily, his survival depends on perfection. To falter is to risk Nero's wrath. Imagine waking each morning and seeing a stranger in the mirror, a stranger you are forced to become. That was Sporus's reality. Nero, meanwhile, grows more unstable with each passing day. His obsession with Sporus is not tempered by time. It deepens. He speaks to him as if they share memories that never existed, recalls events from his marriage to Poppæa, and expects Sporus to respond as though he lived them. He gazes at him for hours, as if by sheer will he can convince himself that his lost wife has returned. For the boy at his side, the psychological torment must have been unbearable. To survive, Sporus learns to perform the impossible, to act out another person's life, to become a living ghost. And yet, in Rome, appearances matter more than truth. For the senators and aristocrats who gather in Nero's halls, questioning the emperor's fantasy is not an option. They smile, they nod, they offer congratulations. Some even present gifts to the empress, playing their part in the grotesque performance. Behind closed doors, they whisper, horrified. But in public, they clap and cheer, because they know the price of honesty. To expose the lie is to invite death as the months pass. The relationship between Nero and Sporus becomes one of Rome's most notorious spectacles. The emperor parades his bride through the streets, introducing him to foreign dignitaries as the empress of Rome. In Greece, where Nero insists on competing in artistic festivals, Sporus is presented to astonished crowds, treated with all the honors of an imperial consort. To outsiders, the fiction is obvious. But Nero demands they treat it as reality. And so they do now step back for a moment and consider the scale of this illusion. The most powerful empire in the world, with its senators, generals, and priests, is bending itself around the delusion of one man. An entire city, an entire nation, is forced to act out a lie to satisfy the grief and obsession of its ruler. And at the center of it all is a boy who never asked for this life. Sporus's existence in these years is one of constant fear. He knows that Nero's love is as dangerous as his rage. The same passion that elevates him to the role of empress could just as easily destroy him if he falters. He lives under the weight of constant scrutiny, performing a role that grows heavier with every passing day. Behind the veils and silks, he is still a teenager, stripped of his identity, forced to live as a ghost of someone else. The tragedy of his life is not just the physical transformation he endured, but the slow erasure of everything he once was. Meanwhile, Rome itself is unraveling. Nero's endless indulgence in art, music, and spectacle drains the treasury. His paranoia grows, and he lashes out at senators, generals, and even members of his own family. Conspiracies brew in the provinces. The Praetorian Guard, once his loyal protectors, begin to doubt him. A senate whispers of rebellion. The empire, stretched to its limits, begins to crack. And yet, Nero seems blind to it all. His world has narrowed to his performances, his luxuries, and his living illusion Sporus. Imagine being in that palace as tensions rise. Outside the walls, rebellion spreads like wildfire. Inside, the emperor sings, plays instruments, and parades his wife before increasingly nervous audiences. The disconnect is staggering. Rome is collapsing, but Nero clings to his fantasy, convinced that if he can keep Poppæa alive in Sporus, he can hold the world together. But reality cannot be ignored forever. In 68 AD, the storm breaks. Rebellions erupt across the empire, led by governors who can no longer tolerate Nero's rule. The Senate declares him a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard abandons him. Suddenly, A man who once commanded legions finds himself alone. Nero flees Rome with only a handful of loyalists. And among them always is Sporus. Picture that scene. Nero, the once mighty emperor, hiding in a villa outside the city. His empire crumbles around him, his enemies close in, and yet he cannot let go of the boy he has remade. Even in his final hours, he keeps Sporus by his side, still calling him by Poppeia's name, still clinging to the illusion that destroyed them both. To Nero, Sporus is not just a companion. He is the last thread of control, the last reminder of the world he refuses to release. But the end comes quickly. Surrounded by enemies, Nero realizes his time is over. Terrified of capture and humiliation, he begs his companions to end his life, but none will strike the blow. Finally, he forces a servant's hand to guide his own dagger. As the blade pierces his throat, his final words are said to have been, "What an artist dies in me." And with that, the reign of Nero ends in blood and despair. For Sporus, however, the nightmare does not end. If anything, it becomes worse. With Nero gone, Sporus becomes a symbol, a living relic of the emperor's madness. He is too valuable to ignore, yet too dangerous to let live freely. Rival claimants to the throne take him in, parading him as a curiosity, dressing him still as Poppaea, forcing him again and again to play the role he never chose. He is passed from one powerful man to another like property, his existence a reminder of Rome's darkest excesses. His life, already stolen once, is stolen again and again by those who see him not as a person, but as an object. The final chapter of Sporus's life approaches with cruel inevitability. Under Emperor Vitellius, his humiliation reaches its peak. Vitellius, eager to entertain the masses, decides that Sporus will be forced into the arena to reenact the myth of Proserpina's abduction, a spectacle of sexual violence and public degradation, designed to amuse a bloodthirsty crowd. For Sporus, this is the ultimate breaking point. He has endured years of torment, but this is one humiliation he will not allow. Before the performance can take place, he makes the only choice that is truly his own. He ends his life, most likely by poison, at barely 20 years old. Think about that for a moment. A child who began as a minor figure in the imperial household, reshaped into a grotesque illusion, forced to live a lie for years, finally takes control of his fate by embracing death. In that single act, Sporus reclaims the one thing denied him his entire life, the right to choose. His story ends not in spectacle, but in silence. And yet, even in death, his existence continues to echo through history as one of the most haunting examples of what unchecked power can do to the human soul. Tragedy of Sporus is not just about Nero's cruelty. It is about the fragility of identity, the dangers of obsession, and the cost of living under a ruler who saw people not as human beings, but as objects to satisfy his desires. His story reminds us that behind every tale of emperors and empires are individuals, people whose suffering is too often lost in the shadows of history. Sporus was one of those people. And though his voice was silenced, his story still speaks across 2,000 years. You stand at the edge of the Roman Forum as rumors spread like wildfire. Nero is dead. The emperor who once commanded legions, who filled palaces with music and fire, who bent reality to his will, has fallen on his own blade. For Rome, his death is both relief and uncertainty. But for Sporus, it is something far more complicated. His master is gone, but his nightmare is far from over. In the chaotic aftermath of Nero's death in 68 AD, Rome teeters on the edge of collapse. The empire has no clear successor, and one by one, powerful generals and governors make their bids for power. Historians would later call this the Year of the Four Emperors. In just 12 months, Rome will see 4 different rulers seize the throne, each rising on the corpses of their rivals, each desperate to claim legitimacy. And caught in the middle of this storm, astonishingly, is Sporus. Imagine being barely 20 years old, a boy transformed into a grotesque echo of the empress, paraded in silks and jewels, and suddenly finding yourself the possession of men far more ruthless than Nero ever was. That was Sporus's reality. With Nero's suicide, he should have been freed. Instead, he became a prize. Whoever controlled him could exploit the symbol he represented, the twisted memory of Nero's reign. The first man to claim him was Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect. Sabinus was a commander of the imperial guard who had betrayed Nero in his final days. By taking Sporus into his household, Sabinus tried to link himself to Nero's legacy, as if possessing the emperor's bride might somehow grant him legitimacy. He treated Sporus not as a person, but as a token of power, a relic of a fallen dynasty. Sporus was paraded through the streets once again, his silks and veils a reminder to all that Rome's rulers could reshape reality as they pleased. But Sabinus's grasp on power was brief. Within weeks, he was cut down by rivals, leaving Sporus adrift once more. And so the boy was passed again, taken by Otho, another claimant to the throne. Otho had been close to Nero in life, even sharing some of his vices, and he too forced Sporus into the role of Pompeia's replacement. The pattern was clear. Sporus was not free. He was an object, passed from one man to another, each treating him as Nero had, each binding him to a role he never chose. Consider for a moment the horror of that existence. Every time Sporus thought his torment might end, another powerful man reached for him. He could not escape the illusion that had been forced upon him. The silks, the jewels, the name Sabina, they followed him wherever he went. He was a living reminder of Rome's darkest indulgence, and no one who held him could resist displaying him. As the year of the 4 emperors raged on, the empire bled. Civil war spread across provinces. Legions clashed with legions, and Rome itself became a battlefield of ambition. Sporus, caught in the heart of it, remained a pawn. By the time Vitellius seized power, his fate was sealed. Vitellius was not content to merely keep Sporus as a private token of Nero's legacy. He wanted spectacle. Vitellius was a man who delighted in cruelty, disguised as entertainment. For him, Sporus was the perfect instrument. He announced plans to force the boy into the arena, to enact the myth of Proserpina's abduction. In this grotesque performance, Sporus would be dressed as the goddess, dragged into the depths of the underworld by Pluto, a staged scene of sexual violence, played out for the amusement of thousands. It was not enough that Sporus had been stripped of his body, his identity, his freedom. Now he was to be publicly degraded before the roaring crowd of the Colosseum. Imagine standing in his place, knowing what awaited you. The heat of the arena, the thousands of eyes fixed upon you, the jeers, the mockery, the violence. After years of forced illusion, this would be the final humiliation. And so Sporus made his choice. Before the performance could take place, he took his own life. Most sources suggest poison. At barely 20 years old, Sporus ended his tragedy on his own terms. In that moment, he did the only thing he could to reclaim his humanity. Death became his final act of defiance, his escape from the grotesque theater that had consumed his life. For years, he had been forced to live as someone else, to perform a role scripted by others. In death, he chose for himself. It was a silent, lonely end. But in that silence was power. Step back and consider what his story represents. Sporus is remembered not as a person in his own right, but as a reflection of others. Nero's obsession, Sabinus's trophy, Otho's symbol, Vitellius's planned spectacle. His identity was stripped away, layer by layer, until nothing remained but an illusion. And yet, even across 2,000 years, his story haunts us because it forces us to confront the cruelty of absolute power. What happens when a ruler believes the world exists solely to satisfy his desires? What happens when grief becomes obsession and obsession becomes law? Sporus's life provides the answer, but the tragedy does not end with him. His story is a window into Rome itself, into an empire where power was unchecked, where human beings could be remade, erased, or destroyed at the whim of those at the top. In the fate of one boy, you see the reflection of an entire system, a system that valued spectacle over humanity, control over compassion, delusion over truth. Rome prided itself on order, discipline, and greatness. Yet in the life and death of Sporus, you see the chaos, cruelty, and fragility beneath the marble surface. Today, when we look back at Rome, we often marvel at its achievements, its roads, its aqueducts, its armies. But beneath that grandeur lies the reality of countless lives consumed by the ambitions of the few. Sporus was one of those lives. He was not a senator, not a general, not a hero carved into marble. He was a boy who became a symbol, who endured unspeakable torment, and whose story has survived precisely because of its horror. And so, when you picture Nero walking through the Forum with his bride by his side, remember what you are really seeing. Not a marriage, not love, but a performance built on suffering, a delusion made flesh. Behind the silks and the jewels was a child who never had a chance to be himself. And that truth, more than any emperor's legacy, is what deserves to be remembered. You walk through the ruins of Nero's Rome, long after the echoes of his reign have faded. The palaces still stand, the marble still gleams, but the empire he once ruled is scarred. The death of Nero did not bring peace. It brought chaos. And in the middle of that chaos lies the forgotten shadow of Sporus, a boy whose fate reveals the cost of Rome's endless thirst for power. After Nero's suicide in 68 AD, Rome entered one of its darkest years. Historians call it the Year of the Four Emperors. In just 12 months, 4 different men would rise to power: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, each clawing his way to the throne through betrayal, war, and blood. Rome was not an empire at peace. It was a beast tearing itself apart. And even in that turmoil, Sporus's name lingered, not because he held power, but because he had become a symbol, a grotesque reminder of Nero's madness. You might think that with Nero gone, Sporus would finally be free. But freedom in Rome was never simple, especially for those marked by imperial whims. To some, Sporus was an object of mockery. To others, he was living evidence of the empire's corruption. And to the ambitious, he was a tool that could be wielded. Whoever controlled him could tie themselves to the memory of Nero. However twisted that memory might be. First came Otho. Before his brief reign as emperor, Otho had been close to Nero. Some sources claim he shared Nero's fascination with extravagance and cruelty. For him, taking Sporus into his household was not just about possession, it was about continuity. Otho presented Sporus as his consort, continuing the charade that Nero had begun. Once again, the boy was dressed in silks, paraded at banquets, and forced to answer to the name of Poppaea. Once again, he was reduced to a role, his own identity erased by the ambitions of powerful men. But Otho's reign lasted only 3 months. After defeat on the battlefield, he chose suicide over capture. And so Sporus passed again into the hands of another Vitellius. If Otho's use of Sporus was grotesque, Vitellius's was far worse. Vitellius was a man who delighted in cruelty. Unlike Nero, who had wrapped his obsession in the language of love, Vitellius made no pretense. To him, Sporus was an object for entertainment, nothing more. He announced his plan to force the boy into the arena, to reenact the myth of Proserpina, the goddess abducted into the underworld. The spectacle would not be a simple play. It was to be a public humiliation, staged before thousands in the Colosseum. designed to strip away whatever shred of dignity Sporus still possessed. Imagine the terror of knowing your life has been reduced to a performance for the crowd's amusement. You would be dressed as a goddess, dragged into the dirt, assaulted for spectacle, your suffering transformed into entertainment. For Sporus, who had endured years of torment, this was the final degradation. The silks, the jewels, the illusion of Poppaea, those had been prisons of gold. But this was a death sentence wrapped in shame. Before the day of the spectacle, Sporus made his choice. He refused to step into the arena. He refused to let his final act be dictated by another man's cruelty. Accounts suggest he found poison, ending his life on his own terms. He was no more than 20 years old, a boy who had been forced into the role of an empress, paraded as a symbol, stripped of his identity, finally took control in the only way left to him. His death was not just an escape. It was a statement. He would not be their entertainment. Think of the silence that followed. In the great city of Rome, where senators debated, soldiers marched, and emperors fell, the death of Sporus was little more than a whisper. To the powerful, he was already forgotten. But his story lingered, carried by historians not as a tale of heroism, but as a warning. The boy who was turned into an empress, who lived as a shadow of someone else, who died rather than face one final humiliation, became a symbol of what happens when human lives are consumed by imperial madness. Now look beyond the tragedy of Sporus, and consider what it tells you about Rome itself. This was not just the story of one boy. It was the story of an empire where power was absolute, where even the body and identity of a child could be reshaped to suit an emperor's desire. Rome built roads, aqueducts, and monuments that still stand today. But it also built prisons of flesh and illusion, where human beings became objects, their lives sacrificed to the whims of the few. The story of Sporus is carved into that history as deeply as any marble inscription. Centuries later, historians still debate the details. Was Sporus truly so similar in appearance to Poppaea? Did Nero believe he had resurrected his wife, or was it all a cruel parody? Was Sporus a victim who endured silently, or did he resist in ways we will never know? The answers are lost. What remains is the undeniable weight of his suffering, the echo of his choices, and the shadow he cast across Rome's legacy. As you walk away from the forum, imagine his face young, delicate, forever trapped between boy and empress. Remember that behind the titles of emperors, behind the grandeur of history, there are always human stories like his. Stories of survival, of despair, and sometimes of final acts of defiance. Sporus may have been forgotten by his own time, but across 2,000 years, his story still demands to be heard. And as Rome moved on through Galba, through Otho, through Vitellius, and finally into the reign of Vespasian, the empire continued to consume lives in the name of power. Sporus was gone, but there would always be others. Rome thrived on spectacle, and spectacle always required sacrifice. You stand in the ruins of Nero's Golden House, the Domus Aurea, long after the emperor's death. The walls are gilded with gold leaf, the ceilings painted with scenes of gods and monsters, the floors covered in mosaics that shimmer in torchlight. Yet despite its beauty, the palace feels haunted. Here, behind these walls, Nero staged not only spectacles of music and poetry, but also the cruel transformation of a boy named Sporus. Though the emperor is gone, his shadow lingers, and the story of Sporus refuses to fade. When Vitellius forced Sporus toward the brink of humiliation in the arena, the boy chose death instead. It was a silent end to a life stolen from him, a choice made in defiance of cruelty. But to truly understand why his story endures, you need to step back once more to Rome itself, and to the system that created him. Rome in the first century was not simply an empire of soldiers and senators. It was also an empire of spectacle. Gladiatorial games, public executions, theatrical performances, and imperial ceremonies were not just entertainment. They were the heartbeat of Roman society. For the people, they were distractions from hardship. For emperors, they were tools of control. And for individuals like Sporus, they became prisons. From the moment Nero saw him, Sporus was trapped in a role he could not escape. To Nero, he was not a person, but a solution and answer to grief, a substitute for the wife he had destroyed. The empire allowed it, because the empire thrived on illusion. Senators, soldiers, and citizens alike bowed to Nero's fantasy, not because they believed it, but because to resist was to invite death. In this way, Sporus's tragedy is not just about one emperor's obsession. It is about a society that surrendered truth for survival. Think of the young boy himself. Raised in the imperial household, he probably dreamed of a modest life of service, perhaps even influence if fortune favored him. Freedmen in Rome often became secretaries, administrators, or trusted servants. Some rose to positions of real power. But Sporus's fate was sealed the moment Nero's gaze fell upon him. In a single instant, he ceased to be himself. His body was altered, his name replaced, his life repurposed. He became the canvas for another's grief. Imagine living every day, knowing that you are no longer allowed to exist as yourself. Your voice is trained, your walk corrected, your gestures rehearsed. Attendants dress you in the silks of a dead woman, fix jewels in your hair, and tell you to smile. To everyone around you, you are no longer Sporus. You are Papier reborn. And no matter how loudly your heart screams otherwise, no one listens. That silence is the deepest cruelty of all. When Nero died, many must have thought Sporus's torment would end. But instead, he was passed from hand to hand like property. Otho, Vitellius, others all saw him not as a victim, but as a prize. His very existence had become symbolic. For those who wanted to tie themselves to Nero's memory, possessing Sporus was a statement. For those who wanted to mock Nero's legacy, degrading Sporus was entertainment. Either way, he was not a human being in their eyes. He was an object. Pause here and reflect on what that means. In Rome, identity was fragile. Power could elevate you to the heights of the world, but it could also strip you bare, leaving nothing of yourself behind. Sporus's story is a warning that behind the marble columns and military triumphs lay a society where the weak could be devoured, where the desires of the powerful could erase a life without consequence. It is easy, across 2,000 years, to see Sporus as only a curiosity of history, a footnote in Nero's biography. But look closer, and his story becomes something far more universal. How many times in history have individuals been forced into roles they did not choose, reshaped to satisfy the needs of others? How many voices have been silenced, their identities erased by systems that valued spectacle and control over humanity? Sporus is not just a figure of Rome. He is a reminder of how fragile freedom can be. Now, picture his final days under Vitellius. Rome is in chaos, emperors rising and falling, civil war tearing the empire apart. And in the middle of this storm, Vitellius decides that the suffering of one boy will be turned into theater. A reenactment of myth staged in the Colosseum, where Sporus would be dressed as Proserpina, dragged into the underworld before the jeering eyes of thousands. To the crowd, it would be entertainment. To Vitellius, it would be power. To Sporus, it would be the final humiliation. But he refused. By choosing death, he denied them their spectacle. In that act, he reclaimed something no emperor could take, his agency. For the first time since Nero had reshaped him, Sporus acted on his own terms. His life had been stolen, but his death was his own. And in that, there is a strange, haunting kind of triumph. When you think of Rome, you may picture emperors in golden crowns, legions marching across the world, or senators debating in marble halls. But remember Sporus too. Remember the boy who was forced to become a ghost, who endured years of torment, who finally chose silence over shame. His story is as much a part of Rome as its victories and monuments. It tells you not of power gained, but of humanity lost. And so, as you walk through the ruins of the Domus Aurea, hear his voice in the silence. Behind the painted walls and glittering mosaics, behind the stories of emperors and generals, there is another history, the secret history of the forgotten, the broken, the erased. Sporus stands among them. His story did not shape the fate of empires, but it speaks across centuries, reminding us of the cost of unchecked power and the fragility of human dignity. You are standing in the shadow of the Roman Colosseum. Its massive arches rise above you, weathered but unbroken, a monument to the empire's hunger for spectacle. For centuries, this arena echoed with the roars of the crowd, the clash of swords, the cries of the dying. It was here that Rome turned suffering into entertainment. And though Sporus never entered these sands, his story is tied to them. Because what Vitellius planned for him was nothing less than public humiliation in this very theater. The myth Vitellius chose, the abduction of Proserpina, was not just any story. In Roman religion, it was a tale of innocence stolen, of a goddess dragged against her will into the underworld. It was a myth about power, violence, and loss. For Vitellius, forcing Sporus to play Proserpina would have been the ultimate mockery. The boy, already stripped of his body, already turned into a living echo of a dead empress, would be made to reenact his own violation in front of thousands. The cruelty of it is staggering, and it tells you everything about Rome's appetite for spectacle, and about how one boy's suffering became entertainment for an empire. But Sporus never gave them that show. By choosing death, he denied the Colosseum its theater. His silence was louder than any performance. Still, the plan itself reveals the truth about Rome at that time. This was a society where emperors rose and fell in months, where civil war tore provinces apart, and where human dignity meant nothing if weighed against the thrill of a crowd. Sporus's story is not just about Nero's obsession. It is about Rome itself, a civilization that could erase a person for the sake of power, illusion, or amusement. Now, step back for a moment. Imagine Rome in 69 AD. The empire is fractured. Legions fight one another instead of foreign enemies. Provinces revolt. The city is filled with whispers, fear, and blood. 4 emperors rise and fall in a single year: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. It is one of the most chaotic times in Roman history, and in the middle of that chaos is Sporus, still remembered, still displayed, still used as a pawn in the games of men who see him not as a person, but as a tool. For Galba, the first of these emperors, Sporus was a dangerous reminder of Nero. To be associated with him would have been political suicide, and so Galba cast him aside. For Otho, who followed, Sporus became a link to the past, a way to connect himself to Nero's legacy. Otho forced him once more into the role of Papaya, parading him as a consort, even as Rome itself began to collapse around them. For Vitellius, Sporus was entertainment, a body to be used, mocked, and discarded. And then, finally, with his death, Sporus was freed from their grasp. But the fact that 3 emperors in succession claimed him tells you how deeply his image mattered. He was no longer Sporus. He was a symbol, twisted into whatever shape the powerful needed. Consider what this means. In life, Sporus's identity was erased. In death, it was consumed by history. He is remembered not for who he was, but for what was done to him. His name appears in the writings of Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, not as a person, but as a reflection of Nero's madness, a footnote in the chronicles of emperors. Yet when you read his story closely, you begin to see something else. Beneath the cruelty, beneath the silence, there is resilience. Because even though he was stripped of everything, Sporus endured for years in a role that would have broken most. And in the end, when faced with ultimate degradation, he chose to act. His death was not surrender. It was resistance. Think of the courage it must have taken. He was a teenager, barely old enough to shape his own future, living under the constant gaze of emperors who held absolute power over life and death. Every day was a performance, every gesture a matter of survival. And yet, in the end, he refused to let them write his final chapter. He claimed that chapter for himself. That choice, that silence, is why we still remember him today. As you walk away from the Colosseum, the stones whisper with echoes of the countless lives consumed here. Gladiators, prisoners, slaves, all turned into entertainment. Sporus's story belongs among theirs, even if he never stepped into the arena. He represents not just one boy's tragedy, but the countless forgotten who were reshaped, erased, and destroyed by Rome's hunger for spectacle. He is one voice among many, reminding us that behind every empire's grandeur lies a shadow of suffering. Now look at the empire itself. By the time Vespasian took power at the end of the year of the 4 emperors, Rome was exhausted. The civil wars had drained its treasury, weakened its armies, and shaken its foundations. Vespasian restored stability, built monuments, and gave Rome the illusion of peace. But the scars remained. The empire would survive for centuries more, but the chaos of 68 to 69 AD revealed the fragility at its core. And Sporus, caught in the middle of it, became the human face of that fragility. His story is not just about Nero's grief or Vitellius's cruelty. It is about an empire that consumed its own children to feed its illusions of power. When you remember Rome, remember the boy who lived as a ghost. Remember Sporus, not as Nero's empress, not as Vitellius's spectacle, but as himself, a child forced into a role he never chose, who endured years of torment, and who, in the end, chose silence over shame. His voice may have been silenced in his lifetime, but across 2,000 years, his story still demands to be heard. And in hearing it, you uncover the truth about Rome, that beneath the marble and the glory lay a world where human lives were consumed by power, and where even in silence, resistance was possible. You walk once more through the streets of Rome, and the air feels heavy with memory. By now, Nero is long dead, Otho has fallen, Vitellius lies defeated, and Vespasian has risen to power. The empire has survived its chaos, rebuilt itself under new rulers, and continued its march through history. But though emperors rise and fall, the story of Sporus lingers like a ghost. His life was brief, his choices few, yet his tragedy remains woven into the very fabric of Rome's legacy. To understand why, you must see how history itself chose to remember him. When Roman historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio wrote of Sporus, they did not see him as a boy. They saw him as a symbol. In their pages, he is not Sporus the person, but Sporus the curiosity. To Tacitus, he was an example of Nero's decadence. To Suetonius, he was evidence of imperial excess. To Dio, he was a grotesque story that revealed the corruption of Rome's rulers. In all of their words, his humanity is missing. The laughter, the dreams, the fears he once carried, those were erased. All that remained was the performance Nero forced upon him. Pause and think about that. Even in death, Sporus was denied his identity. He was remembered only as an echo of Poppaea, a reflection of Nero's madness, a tragic pawn in the theater of Rome. It is only when you look between the lines, when you imagine the silences in their accounts, that you glimpse the real boy, the boy forced to wear silks, a boy who endured stares and whispers, the boy who finally chose death over degradation. Now, place yourself in the world of Vespasian, the emperor who emerged victorious from the year of the 4 emperors. Vespasian was a practical man, a soldier who valued order and discipline, Under him, Rome stabilized. The treasury was refilled, the legions reorganized, the city restored. To many Romans, he was a savior, a man who pulled the empire back from the brink. But in restoring order, Vespasian also buried the memory of the chaos that came before. And with that burial came the silencing of voices like Sporus's. For the Roman elite, Sporus was an embarrassment, a reminder of Nero's grotesque indulgence. To speak of him was to reopen wounds, to recall the years when Rome nearly collapsed under madness. And so, his story was pushed to the margins, preserved only in whispers and footnotes. But silence does not erase truth. His tragedy still lived on in the shadows, waiting for history to uncover it. Imagine being Sporus in those final months, knowing that the empire had moved on without you, that your suffering had become nothing more than gossip at banquets and scrawls in private letters. For years, he had been paraded as an empress, mocked as a spectacle, used as a pawn. And when he finally took control of his fate through death, the empire simply shrugged and carried on. That indifference is perhaps the cruelest cut of all, because to Rome, his life meant nothing. But to us, looking back across 2,000 years, it means everything. Consider what his story reveals about power. Nero was not the first ruler to twist human lives for his desires, and he would not be the last. Throughout history, from Rome to modern times, those in power have reshaped others, forced them into roles, silenced their voices, and used them as symbols rather than people. Sporus is part of that larger story. He is a reminder that behind every empire, behind every ruler, are countless forgotten lives sacrificed for spectacle and control. Now look closer at the silence in the sources. Tacitus mentions Sporus briefly, almost as an afterthought, but his words carry a weight of horror. Suetonius, in his biographies of the Caesars, lingers on the grotesque details of Nero's marriage to the boy. Dio, writing later, echoes the same themes of cruelty and spectacle. None of them ask who Sporus was before Nero chose him. None wonder what he might have wanted, or who he might have become. And perhaps that silence speaks louder than their words. It tells you how completely Rome erased him. But history has a way of preserving what it tries to forget. Sporus's story survived, not because Rome wanted it remembered, but because it was too grotesque to disappear. The sheer cruelty of it burned itself into the records, forcing future generations to confront it. And in that survival, his story finds a strange kind of immortality. Not the immortality Nero promised himself through art, not the immortality Rome sought through conquest, but the immortality of a warning, a reminder of what unchecked power can do. Walk now into the ruins of the Palatine Hill, where emperors once ruled. Imagine the halls filled with laughter, music, and debate. And then imagine the boy, dressed in silk, sitting beside Nero, forced to play the role of empress. The senators bow, the courtiers smile, the soldiers salute. Everyone plays their part in the lie, because to resist is death. That image, frozen in time, tells you more about Rome than any marble arch or triumphal column. It shows you the cost of fear, the weight of silence, the way illusions can consume truth. And then remember his end. Poison in a cup, silence instead of spectacle. A refusal to be mocked one final time. That act was Sporus's legacy. It was the only moment he truly controlled. And though Rome may have forgotten him, that act of defiance still speaks to us. It tells you that even in the darkest moments, even when stripped of everything, a person can still choose. And sometimes, that choice is the most powerful act of all. So as you stand here, looking at the ruins of Rome, ask yourself, who was Sporus really? Was he a victim, defined by suffering? Or was he something more, a survivor who endured the impossible, and who, in the end, chose dignity over humiliation? The truth is, we will never know. But perhaps the very act of asking the question, honors him more than Rome ever did. Because in asking, we restore a fragment of his humanity, a piece of the boy lost beneath layers of cruelty and illusion. You are standing in the quiet of a Roman necropolis, where weathered tombstones lean against one another, their inscriptions faded by centuries of rain and sun. Here, emperors lie beside generals, slaves beside freedmen, and the forgotten beside the remembered. The silence is heavy, and it invites you to ask, where is Sporus? Where does his story end in stone and memory? The truth is, we do not know. No monument bears his name. No inscription records his life. He was erased from Rome's marble, but not from its history. His grave, if it ever existed, has vanished. Yet his story remains carved into the collective memory of what Rome was capable of. As you walk among these graves, you begin to realize something. The story of Sporus is not just about Nero, or Otho, or Vitellius. It is about how empires consume individuals. Rome was a machine built on conquest, wealth, and spectacle. It promised glory, but demanded sacrifice. Soldiers gave their blood, slaves gave their labor, and in Sporus's case, he gave his very identity. His tragedy is a reminder that the grandeur of Rome was always paid for in human lives. Imagine the boy once more, seated beside Nero, veiled in silk, silent while the emperor spoke of love that was really obsession. Imagine the same boy paraded before foreign dignitaries, introduced as an empress he never was. Then picture him, years later, staring at the prospect of the arena, of humiliation so complete it would strip away even the illusion of dignity. And finally, picture him lifting a cup of poison, choosing silence over shame. That is the arc of his life. It is short, it is brutal, and yet it echoes across 2,000 years, because it reveals something we would rather forget, that power unchecked has no limits to its cruelty. Think of how the historians recorded him. Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio, they wrote of emperors, of battles, of dynasties. And Sporus appears only as a shadow, a curiosity, a grotesque example of Nero's madness. They did not write his thoughts, his dreams, his fears. They did not care to. And yet, the fact that his name appears at all is extraordinary. Rome erased countless lives without a trace, but Sporus's suffering was so great, his story so disturbing, that it forced its way into history's record. That survival, fragile though it is a kind of immortality. Pause here and consider what that means. Sporus is not remembered because he held power or commanded armies or changed the course of the empire. He is remembered because he was powerless. His story endured precisely because it revealed the cruelty of those who ruled. In that sense, Sporus stands as a mirror, reflecting not who he was, but who they were. And maybe that is why his story still matters. Because it forces us to look not at the monuments of Rome, but at its shadows. Now walk with me through the ruins of the Forum. Senators once debated here. Emperors once displayed their triumphs, and the people once gathered to cheer or jeer. It was here that Nero paraded Sporus as Papalier, expecting applause, demanding silence from dissenters. Think of the courage it took to survive those moments, to endure the stares, the whispers, the unspoken horror. Every step Sporus took was a performance, and every performance was a battle for survival. That resilience, unrecorded though it is also part of his story. When Vitellius planned his final humiliation, Sporus could have submitted. He could have stepped into the arena, played the role of Proserpina, and lived perhaps a little longer as a broken shell. But he did not. He chose death. That act, simple and final, was his rebellion. It was his way of saying, I will not be your spectacle. I will not be your entertainment. I will not let you write my ending. And in that choice, he reclaimed something he had been denied his entire life, his agency. This is why, across centuries, his story feels haunting. Because it is not just about cruelty. It is about resilience. It is about the smallest spark of resistance in the face of overwhelming power. And it is about the truth that even when stripped of everything, a person can still choose. Sporus chose silence. And that silence still echoes. So what does his story teach us? That behind every empire's marble face, there are cracks. That for every triumphal arch, there is a forgotten grave. That for every emperor's portrait, there are countless erased faces. Sporus is one of those erased faces, brought back to us not as a hero, but as a reminder. His tragedy tells us that the measure of a civilization is not in its monuments, but in how it treats its most vulnerable. By that measure, Rome was as fragile as the boy it consumed. Now imagine this. You are in the present day, standing once more in the ruins of the Colosseum. Tourists walk past with cameras, guides tell stories of gladiators, and the air hums with history. Few mention Sporus. His name is not carved on the plaques, not inscribed on the stones. And yet, if you listen closely, you can almost hear him. Not in words, but in silence. In the emptiness between the cheers of the crowd, in the shadows beneath the arches, his story lingers. Perhaps that is his true legacy. Not a monument of stone, but a story whispered across time. A story that forces us to confront the darkness of power, the fragility of identity, and the resilience of the human spirit. Sporus was not meant to be remembered, but he is. And in remembering him, we honor all the forgotten who suffered in silence. So as this story ends, you must carry his memory with you. Remember that history is not only emperors and battles. It is also the secret histories of those erased, those broken, those who resisted in ways small but profound. Sporus's life was short, but it was not meaningless. His silence still speaks. And if you listen, it tells you a truth as old as Rome and as new as today. That unchecked power destroys, that illusions consume, and that even the smallest act of defiance can echo for millennia. And so, as you close this chapter, picture him one last time. A boy forced to wear the silks of an empress, paraded as a ghost, humiliated as a spectacle. And then, finally, a boy who chose his own ending. His story may have been forgotten by his world, but it has not vanished, because you have heard it now. And in hearing it, you keep it alive. And so, Sporus disappears from the pages of history, his voice silenced, his grave unmarked, his life reduced to whispers in the chronicles of Rome. Was he merely a pawn, remembered only because of Nero's madness? Or was his final choice, his refusal to submit, a quiet act of rebellion that deserves to echo louder than the voices of the emperors who destroyed him? 2,000 years later, we are left with fragments, contradictory accounts, faded memories, unanswered questions. Did Sporus truly believe he had reclaimed his dignity in death? Or was he simply crushed by the weight of an empire that allowed him no escape? The truth lies buried, and perhaps it always will. But what do you think? Was Sporus nothing more than a tragic victim of power? Or was he, in his final act, something more, a defiant soul who refused to let Rome write the last line of his story? Some stories were never meant to stay buried. Don't let them vanish. Keep them alive with us.